Great, thank you very much. Okay, so it's going to take me a while to get used to this microphone, so do apologise if I'm messing with it for a while. Okay, so we heard earlier a lot about open access to research publications, so primarily journal articles, but also conference papers, preprints, and other kind of textual information that you might produce from your research. One of the other outputs of most of our research, in fact, almost all research, is research data as well. So this presentation is just going to go over, in a kind of abstract way, how to open up our research data and why it matters. I'm not going to go into details for different disciplines because, as you'll understand, each discipline has very different types of data, has different needs for data, and so we won't kind of dig down too much into the details. But I'm just going to go over kind of what is data, what does open mean, and how can you go about making yours open. So just a bit of an introduction to me. So I'm down as being from the University of Oxford, which is true, but I just submitted my DPhil thesis. So I'm actually soon hopefully going to viva and graduate from Oxford, and I've now got a job at the University of Cambridge, which is why they're up there as well. And so I did my PhD research on the genetic control of mosquito populations. So I was looking at producing sterile Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, who are dengue vectors, using genetic modification, and also stopping mosquitoes transmitting disease, or finding out how they're stopped transmitting disease by a bacteria called Wolbachia. So it was interesting molecular biology work that was very much up at the applied end, and I also did an industrial studentship, so I have some idea of the kind of problems and issues that businesses have as well in the open access and open data sphere. My job at Cambridge is managing two projects, one of which is called a strategic research initiative in synthetic biology, and the other one is called Open Plant, which is a large synthetic biology research centre looking at plant synthetic biology specifically. But there's a real focus in both of those on open technologies, and so I'm now a lot more focused on how do we open up the science system at the level of things that fall outside research data and access to publications. So things like hardware, software, biological reagents, and the sort of more patentable side of intellectual property rather than the copyright. But I still maintain an interest in copyright. And one of the things that sort of brought me to this area was being involved with Open Knowledge, who are an international organisation who look at all manner of openness in all spheres of knowledge, but we do have a large open science working group. So if this two-day conference kind of piques your interest, I would recommend having a look online for the Open Knowledge, Open Science Working Group, which I've coordinated for 3 or 4 years now. And we will have lots of local groups as well, several across Europe. So do check out if we have somebody in your country who you might like to get involved with. And my final thing that I do is working on a text and data mining project, because one of the things that was mentioned in talks earlier is that putting your information online, I think in the video also, putting your information online is one thing, making it available for machines to read and make it reusable in that way is another. And so we're trying to teach researchers how to use simple text and data mining tools, and in some cases quite complex text and data mining tools, and also try and assert that researchers have the right to reuse information and data. In the UK, we're lucky enough to have recently been given a copyright exception for non-commercial text and data mining. And one thing that Content Mine, who I also work with, are doing is trying to encourage that to be extended to the rest of Europe so that you can all use text and data from the scientific literature for research without worrying about copyright impediments. And so our motto for this is the right to read is the right to mine, which is that if as a researcher you have lawful access to a document, be it something your university subscribes to or something else that you're able to access online legally, that you should also have the right to read it with a machine. If we could do something, if we could sit there reading 2,000 papers and transcribing all the data from them ourselves, we should legally be allowed to use a machine to do the same thing, because that is literally what people do for systematic reviews and for meta-analyses and for lots of research. So that's an introduction to kind of some of the projects that I'm involved with, and if you're interested to talk to me about any of those, I'd be more than happy to later on. But now let's move on to the main topic of the talk, which is how to open up our research data. And I'm coming at you very much as someone who's just written a thesis, so I understand the pain of research data management. And so some of the examples I'll be giving are from my own personal experience. There is a problem with some discussions around research data that they're somewhat abstracted to our own personal experiences of managing data as students, as early career researchers. And so hopefully we'll be taking a look that's very much grounded in the way we actually use data. And I've tried to keep things lightweight because it's after lunch, and so I'm expecting to see some nodding heads. Don't be embarrassed if you fall asleep, I don't mind. And I've tried to mix up some interactive activities, so you'll be talking to people around you. So let's get started. Okay, so after we had an introduction to Creative Commons earlier, here are my permissions. You're very welcome to do anything with this presentation that you like. Okay, so first of all, what does data mean? So typically when you think of data, you might think of a spreadsheet or a CSV file or a table of values. But actually in science, data can look like a lot of things. So yeah, sure, we do have some tables up here with some numbers in them and some references to things. But we've also got stuff like phylogenetic trees. That's also a representation of data. We've got XY graphs, we've got mathematical notations, we have images, and we have text. And so embedded within this text, there's certain types of data, there's species names, there's references to other papers that in itself could be useful data for someone who's researching how people link across the literature, as I know some people in this room do. So have a think about what data means to you. Is there anyone whose data I haven't represented in these kinds of forms here? Does anyone have any other sorts of data? Anyone using videos in their research? Okay, so a few using videos. How about audio files? Anyone use audio files? No? Okay, so quite a few people. So my PhD was in the university zoology department, so quite a few people there interested in animal sounds, animal behavior, so a lot of audio-visual data as well. Anyone think of anything else that I've missed? Yeah? Protein structures, yeah, absolutely. So more different forms of information there. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So computational programs in some cases are used to process data. In some cases, you might reasonably describe them as part of your data for your research. So it depends how broad you're going. But the point is that a lot of things can be data. And so just broaden your horizons as to what you consider data. And essentially think about, it's your evidence, right? Your data is your evidence for the assertions that you're making in your paper. And so whatever you need to provide to back that up, that is your data. And however difficult it is, you're going to have to manage it somehow. Okay, so what does open mean? So we've talked a fair amount earlier. Most of the talks this morning referenced openness in one way or another. So to take it down to its very basic level, it means sharing what we already create. We're already making data, we're already making papers, we're already making computer programs, we're already making a whole bunch of stuff through our research. And openness just means sharing that more widely than we might already do. So what is open in the context that I'm talking about? Because it's a pretty broad word, right? It's a very ill-defined word in many respects. But luckily, someone thought about this a few years ago and created the open definition. And so the open definition is, it's compatible with the Budapest Open Access Initiative definition of what open access is. It's compatible with most definitions of open data. And basically it says that a piece of data or content is open if anyone is free to use, reuse, and redistribute it. And so those are three separate things there, right? So you can be free to use something without being free to reuse it in a different way or to redistribute it. And so the talk this morning that went through a load of Creative Commons licenses and the different rights that you can retain or license to give away to people, they're all represented there. So there are some, we're not giving away all our rights when we make something open. We might decide to put it in the public domain and say, you can do what you like, that's fine. But the open definition says that openers should be subject only, at most, to the requirement to attribute the creator and or share alike, which was also discussed earlier, which means that any kind of corresponding works, derivative work, should also be shared under the same license, so a viral license. Okay, so the open definition existed for quite a few years, but the open definition doesn't really give you very much guidance as to exactly how to make something open. It just describes what an open thing might look like. And so in around 2008, 2009, a group of people associated with the open science movement generally, so Rufus Pollock, who was at Open Knowledge, Peter Murray-Rust, also of Open Knowledge and at Cambridge, Cameron Naylan, who now works for PLOS, and has been a kind of long-time advocate for open science, and John Wilbanks, who at the time was with Creative Commons, working on science projects, came up with the Panton Principles, which were principles for open data in science, applying the open definition to scientific data. So they pointed out that science, as we practice it, is based on building on, reusing, and openly criticising the published body of scientific knowledge. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. It's basically the scientific method and the process. So for science to effectively function and for society to reap the full benefits from scientific endeavours, it's crucial that science data be made open. And so the Panton Principles aimed to distill in just a few simple principles practical ways that researchers can ensure that data that they want to share, and we'll come back to that later, is made clearly open for reuse. Okay, so number one, when publishing data, make an explicit and robust statement of your wishes. Say what you want to happen. This is one of the problems with a lot of data sets that are on the internet now. It's just unclear if you can use them or not, and it causes a lot of confusion. Sometimes the same with papers as well. So make it clear what you want to happen. Use a recognized waiver or license that is appropriate for data. So a lot of lawyers have spent a lot of time and energy coming up with the correct wording to enable you to share data. So making up your own wording that probably doesn't have a very sound legal basis is not a good idea. Make use of what's available to you. And so Creative Commons are probably one of the most recognized sets of licenses. But being appropriate to data is quite important. So a lot of the Creative Commons licenses were never written for data. They were written for creative content, for videos, for artworks, for books. They were never written to allow you to license data sets, because data's quite... So if we think of data as a series of facts, facts are not copyrightable, and so it does lend itself... But of course, if you're a history of art student and your data are a lot of portraits that you've been studying, then of course different things come into play. So sometimes copyright can apply to your data, sometimes it's less clear if copyright even applies to your data. It's a bit of a grey area. But the main thing to remember is that most Creative Commons licenses were not written legally to apply to data. So you need to choose something that's appropriate. And so going further, the Panton Principles suggest that if you want your data to be effectively used and added to by others, so we're going back to that right to reuse and to redistribute, it should be open as defined by the open knowledge or open data definition, which we just went through. And in particular, non-commercial and other restrictive clauses should not be used. So what it's saying here is that if you want to uphold the idea that anyone should be able to use your data, putting something like a Creative Commons non-commercial license on doesn't cut the mustard in this situation. So Non-commercial and restrictive clauses should not be used. In addition, what the Panton Principles recommend is explicit dedication of the data underlying published science. And that's quite important. So what the principles are calling for is not that everyone should publish their data immediately that they get it. And that's something that incites a lot of panic in quite a lot of researchers when you talk about open data. They're like, well, I need to publish, I need to publish. So we're recommending that once you've published, that the evidence, the data underlying the assertions that you've made in the scientific literature is dedicated to the public domain via the public domain dedication license or CC0, which is Creative Commons 0, which isn't actually a license, it's a waiver. So it's basically waiving rights and saying this is in the public domain and you can use it. So that's strongly recommended by the Panton Principles because it ensures compliance with both the open definition, with the Science Commons Protocol, which was put together by Creative Commons, and with other protocols for implementing open access to data. Now, you might ask, why not a requirement for attribution? Which, as we've seen, Creative Commons by or requiring attribution is probably it's one of the most recommended licenses for things like papers. And we heard about that earlier, that it's a good idea to require people to attribute you. So there are two reasons why the Panton Principles authors decided to recommend a waiver and putting stuff into the public domain rather than using CC BY specifically for data. The first is that you should be able to rely. There's two ways you can require someone, there's two ways you can ensure someone attributes you. You can either do it legally, which is what CC BY does. It says you have to attribute me, otherwise you're breaking the law. Or you can rely on community norms. So in science, we have to cite stuff, right? Otherwise we're plagiarizing. So the Panton Principles relies on the community norm and kind of self-governance of scientists that if you use someone else's data or republish someone else's data and you don't cite it, you're probably not going to work in science for very long if someone finds out. So we're relying on kind of the community norms of citation and just being nice that goes alongside, as opposed to using a legal instrument to say you must do this. And the other reason is that often people are remixing, reusing data sets. They're going to have to try their very hardest to reference everything, to cite everything. However, there is a problem with attribution stacking, it's called. So if you require that everyone attributes a piece of data, and someone scoops up 2,000 sets of data and publishes a fully comprehensive database analysis, then the next person to come along, do they only have to cite that data, or do they have to cite all of the other data? And if they're collecting 2,000 meta-analyses and then citing all of the data underlying it, you suddenly got yourselves a bit of a headache. So that is sometimes a barrier. And this probably doesn't happen a lot right now because we don't do that much big data science. But the more and more science that is available and is machine readable and accessible to computers, and we can do these kind of big data discovery projects, which Horizon 2020 is very, very keen on, attribution stacking will become more of an issue. And we can have more of a conversation on this if you prefer. If you prefer later on, we can come back to it. But the point is that CC BY is not the ideal license for data. And it was never written for data. So the Panton Principles does recommend a waiver. And this is not radical, this is not out there. If you look up data repositories online, many of them recommend CC0 for data, including some of the much larger repositories like Dryad, and Figshare also recommends CC0. And if you do put your data in the public domain, you'll be joining awesome people like Ernest Haeckel and his wonderful drawings of sea life, which only entered the public domain after the copyright had expired. So we had to wait for death plus 70 years for this guy's work to enter the public domain. So, get in there early. It's a good way to do it. Okay, so there we go. What is the problem with making our data open? It's simple, right? You just express your wishes. There's a beautiful definition. There's a beautiful set of licenses that are recommended. Everyone should be doing it. So, do we actually share as a scientific community? So based on your knowledge of your own communities, put your hands up if you would say that you can usually get access to most of the data you need pretty easily. Hands up. That's even worse than I was expecting. Okay. Put your hands up if mostly you can get hold of it. You just need to chase people by email quite a bit and sort of email original authors, and then eventually you'll manage to get hold of the data that you need to do your research. Oh, okay, so that's a few. Put your hands up if you really struggle to get hold of the data that you need despite emailing authors. There's a few. And anyone who's left, what situation would you put yourselves in? Anyone who thinks it's absolutely awful, I can never get hold of anything, it's terrible. Okay, so we're somewhere. Who has to pay for their data? Okay, it's just Peter. Okay. It's almost like they don't like you, Peter. Okay, so we're on a spectrum. Some people, and it is discipline specific. Some disciplines are better at sharing data than others. And there's a whole lot of interesting papers around culture and social aspects of being a scientist and being in a research community and why certain disciplines share more than others. And sometimes it's just a result of you kind of have to, because you really can't analyze this data on your own. So that's the hypothesis as to why astronomy researchers tend to share their data. There's too much of it. You can't possibly actually create useful results if you don't allow other people to see it. So they have a fair history of sharing. The Human Genome Project, that was a small project, or at least, it's not a small project, it's a massive project, but it was essentially at the beginning quite a small set of people that made a unilateral decision that they would release all their data. And since then, it's become the community norm in genomics that you mostly release data. And like the time between actually sequencing something and releasing it differs depending on what organisms you're working on and all the rest of it. But the norm of actually sharing it openly once it's done was established essentially because a small group of people said so. And then it became normal for everybody. So there's quite some interesting work on that. But there's also a lot of empirical studies on data sharing. Most of them are pretty bad. Not the studies, just the results in terms of data sharing. So you can look up any of these. They pretty much all say that not enough people share their data. So there's across different authors. So some looked at PLOS journals. Admittedly, this is a bit skewed towards biomedical journals. But yeah, all of these the essential message is there's not enough going on. Jelte Vischutz did a study where in psychology, he tracked down a very large set of data sets from a cohort of a set of journals. And he reported that it was far less likely to get data from authors where their result, because he wrote to them saying, I want to recalculate things, I'm doing this study, would you send me your data? It was much less likely to get data from authors where their result was very, very close to p equals 0.05. So, he doesn't make any causal suggestions based on that in his paper, but he does say that there is a correlation between the strength of evidence and the quality of reporting of statistical results and the willingness to share research data. So there's some interesting work out there. I didn't update this slide, so there's been some more articles more recently. And basically, we share data some of the time, and it really differs depending on your particular research community. So an interesting paper just recently, March 2015, so human paleogenetics have become very good at data sharing. And so this team found that data sharing was getting close to 100% of papers that they looked at. You could easily get hold of the data. And so, that could be a cultural community thing. It could be because of the kind of advances in promoting open data and open science within the research bodies that fund paleogenetics. Who knows? But they're finding that it is increasing. And generally, more and more funders are demanding that we share stuff. So we can expect to see some increases. Okay, so bit of interaction for you after lunch before you drop off. So we've seen that it's recommended from the Panton Principles and from numerous bodies, including the European Commission are bringing it in with their open data pilot, that you share data. And people clearly are not 100% there yet. So why is that? And so I'd like you to get into groups. I wasn't sure how many people we'd have. So 3, 4, don't worry if you don't exactly get into groups of 3. So you've got 10 minutes to list 3 reasons why you would share your data, and 3 reasons why you might not share your data. And it's very much your data, right? We're not thinking in the abstract. It's you in your groups discussing your research and thinking of where you would and wouldn't. So I want justifications that are actually grounded in what data you currently handle and work with. Does that make sense to everyone? Or would you like any more explanations? Any questions? Okay, perfect. So it's 22 now. So turn to face your partners. You've got 10 minutes, and at 10:02 we'll come back and find out why you would and wouldn't share data. Off you go. Okay, there we go. It's a couple of seconds delay. Okay, so we'll start bringing people in. So I hope you managed to have some interesting conversations in your groups. So hopefully you've all got 3 reasons why you would share your data and why you might not share. And so we'll just get 1 reason why you would share your data from each group. And we're going to start at the front of the room. So people at the back are going to have the hardest job to come up with something that hasn't already been said. But just your favorite reason, and just a little bit of an explanation of the types of data you're talking about, would be excellent. So should we start with this group at the front? Nice and loud. Oh, we've got a microphone. Excellent.
Now, we're just thinking that what's quite interesting in this is maybe to stimulate other people by taking part yourself in the move. So there was this funny Belgian expression for this.
To put your stone in the river stream.
Ah, nice.
That was the poetic moment. Yeah, but that's basically like stimulating the move by being an actor yourself somehow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Good reason. Should we go back?
Okay, I think this is something that applies to any kind of data. And I think this is an interesting reason because it can be something that would make you share your data at the same time as it might make you not share your data.
Excellent.
Which is the reason is that if you're not sure of your data, if you're not certain, so in some sense it would make you want to share your data because you want the input of other people to tell you like, I'm not completely sure about this, I would like input from people, maybe they have similar experiences and they would like to share.
Yep.
At the same time, it might make you not share because there is a strong culture in publishing that meaning that you publish, you put it out there, has to mean that you're certain about it. Somehow this is the culture that you need to be sure about it. So it's kind of a both ways thing.
Absolutely. Very good one. So if we pass on to this group.
I think we are talking about that if we publish the data open access, then we might increase the collaborations, and because the people, when they have access to those results, they're interested and they contact us, and we will discuss and have some new ideas and increase the collaborations.
Brilliant. Yeah, collaboration is a really big one. Just keep on passing it back.
Maybe to be a trendsetter, because we like the idea of open science. It's more work if you want to publish your data online. So there's some effort, but maybe you just want to do it to show if we all do this as a society, we can get something out of it.
That is a very nice reason, and you're obviously a very nice group. I'm not sure how many. I'm not sure how many people would would use that as a specific argument. We've got some people in the room who do work in open access and open data policies in universities. I'm not sure that one would fly with the people who are not willing to be early adopters. But absolutely, if you're behind the idea of it and kind of you like the sort of ideology and the moral arguments, that's a great one. Okay, let's go to the next group.
We were thinking about helping you deepen your work, actually, so on the basis of the other one, but it's like a bit the same of the cooperation and putting all the stone in the same river.
Everyone's going to be using that now, you know. If anyone's tweeting, that's a tweet right there.
The main reason that we made our dataset open was because we're incredibly lazy, and we wanted other people to analyze it for us. And we also had no idea really what the useful research questions were around the dataset, and then how to do that. And so we gave it to people who knew much more than us. That was our main reason.
Good.
One idea we have is that it increases the visibility of your work and the credibility of your work, and in some ways also the reputation. So it's good for your reputation.
Excellent. And I think we'll be hearing more this afternoon about how it might increase your reputation.
So it's really hard already by now, but we also had the idea that if you share your or if you have always your own perspective of the data, you can somewhat get a narrow view. So if you open up your data, you maybe get another one's view on your data, which can inspire you the other way around in turn. So this could be another reason.
Yeah, definitely. Put your hands up if you feel like, so if your discipline, I don't know, I haven't spoken to everyone yet, so I don't know the span of disciplines in the room, but put your hands up if you feel like your discipline, there's mostly only one answer from the data, or it's usually fairly clear what's going on. Okay, there's a few. Maths and physics are generally quite hot on this. Put your hands up if your data is pretty much always open to interpretation, and that all the assertions that you put in papers are fairly kind of could be taken one or other ways. Okay, so there's a few that it's mostly open to interpretation. So again, it's a difference between fields. So to what extent something like that could be useful or not useful. And again, it's not being sure as well. Another group raised that point of you may want to because you want the perspectives, or you may want to because you may not want to because you like to think that you're right, and you wouldn't you don't want other people coming and telling you you're not. So if you pass it along, have someone got the right? Excellent. Yeah, we go. Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. So it doesn't necessarily need to complement rather than oppose your own. Yeah.
Okay, it's hard to say something that previous group didn't already mention, but one of our favorite reason was, if we're sharing that, then probably the other people will share also, and then, as somebody already mentioned, we can be the trend setters, and we can benefit from, some other groups can benefit from the data that we share, and we can benefit from the data that other groups share.
Absolutely, so a bit of reciprocity is good. At the back?
Well, my reason for sharing data comes from maybe open source, mind break. And that is, if I share my data, then maybe someone whom I don't know picks it up and actually contacts me, and then I get to work with a totally new person.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And there's plenty of examples online of people that have found collaborators from the other side of the world that way.
Okay, so it's even more difficult now to come up with something new,
but
there's one word that we haven't heard yet, and that's impact, which is very big with the Commission right now, and to make your data open will enhance the impact of your data, whether it's societal or economic or academic.
Absolutely, and so tracking some of that I think will be talked about later as well.
Because everything has already been spoken of, so I had to suddenly come up with something new.
Sorry, you can repeat one. Just repeat the most important one. We won't mind.
I think the one I wrote down was that publications are judged by generally the amount of citations you get. All your research work is generally judged by that. And the possibility of getting more citation is when everyone has access to your data and your research. So I think that's the most important reason. I can get more citation by publishing it in open data and publishing it in closed data.
Yeah, and there have been studies showing a slight citation advantage for papers that are published along with open data, although we're still in the early stages yet, so it's kind of difficult to draw concrete conclusions. Back.
Okay. Let's see if my voice keeps all the time. For us, it's like going to this, everybody is enabled to do research. Somehow, sometimes you don't have the infrastructure, but if you get the data, you can develop your research on top of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those who need secondary data in order to do their research, it's very, very helpful. Do we have any more? Has everyone given their answer? Excellent. So I think you pretty much covered it. I mean, there are not many more reasons that I would give, and also it's quite a personal thing as to why you personally would want to share your data. So it's just something to think about. So I will add nothing to your suggestions there. So why might we not share? Okay, so we're going to play a little game now, which was actually it was first debuted at an international development event, and so I just want to give you the feeling that we're not alone as scientists. So open data is not just a science thing. Governments, NGOs, lots of other organisations are also advocating, promoting open data in different sectors. And so I imagine most of you, your governments will have some kind of open data portal where you can get information. That's becoming increasingly common. And actually, the reasons why you might and might not share your data are very common across all of those types of data. It's not just us. And so this is from the Open Data for Development workshop, and it is Open Data Excuse Bingo. So let's see who gets all three of their excuses on the board. Okay, so these aren't comprehensive, but essentially these are common reasons why people who are asked to share any sort of data refuse to share it. So we'll have a show of hands from any group that has any of the following. Right, terrorists and or criminals will use it. Who's got that? Okay, we've got one group with that. Could you explain what sort of data you thought terrorists or criminals might use? Nuclear bombs, yeah, absolutely. So in general, even the most ardent of open data advocates will generally say that if your data tells someone how to create a weapon of mass destruction, tells someone where the very, very last of a endangered and very cute parrot is living, that you probably shouldn't publish the exact geographical coordinates. If your data is going to give people private information that they could use for identity fraud, it's probably not a good idea to publish it. So there are very, very genuine reasons why some types of research data should not be published, and they include national security, protection of endangered species, personal privacy, and a whole bunch of other stuff. So it is a good one. Well done, group. They got that. Okay, it's too complicated. Does anyone have it's too complicated? Yeah. So do you want to explain a little bit about the sort of data that you were thinking of there?
I was just thinking about, for instance, when you get experimental data, it could be that you have a lot of sensors everywhere, not the same accuracy and so on. But still, you put them in the same data set and you don't use everything out of it. Some of this data is more accurate, so you use those, but you want to publish everything because some are just there for indication. But if some people start to rely on this indication, then it might be a bit tricky. So you need to specify a bit more. And I got once this raw data set. That was very complicated, and I had to put along a code in MATLAB to extract the data. Well, it takes time. Yeah, absolutely, it does take time. So was the data, this was your data or a data set that you got from someone else? That was mine. That was yours. I did it and I put it online. Yeah, yeah. And did you have a way of kind of tracking what had been included and excluded from your analysis, or was that the sort of complicated part? You mean in my analysis? Or yeah, that was quite okay to make it clear. But it took a while to just detail why and to which measure people can use this row of data or this one. Yeah, absolutely. So it's complicated. It's too complicated, can be a valid excuse as to why you would need more resources or something to put on it, but it's not a kind of comprehensive, you just shouldn't do it. It clearly does require extra time and effort. And, you know, we all have lives, some of us, and we all have projects that we need to work on. So there are definite trade-offs to be made when you're sharing data.
Okay, people may misinterpret the data. Anyone got that? Quite a few. Oh, you're doing well. You got 2 out of 3, you guys. Or was it the group behind you that got the last one? So anyone who gets 3 out of 3, it's bingo, by the way. You've got to all shout in unison. Okay, people may misinterpret the data. So put hands up again. Who was it? Do you want to explain a little bit about the sort of data you felt might be misinterpreted? These guys. You put, yeah. Or this group put their hand up to say they got the excuse. So
I'm not sure actually what we meant. but what I can say is sort of another thing is that it goes along the same. Is this on, by the way? Yeah.
Yeah, you just have to direct it towards you. Yeah.
It's almost the same as the terrorists and criminals, but it can also be used for economical purpose. People taking advantage of your data, doing analysis of stock marketing and the future predictions and so on. So it can be. Well,
so making bad interpretations.
Well, not bad, but taking advantage of.
Okay.
Of the data.
So deliberately misinterpreting the data as opposed to accidentally misinterpreting.
Yeah, sort of.
Yeah. Okay. So this is quite a common one with things like so potentially with things that are politically charged subjects like economic growth, like climate change. That comes up as a reason not to publish data quite a lot. Misinterpretation also in certain like medical devices, clinical trials, that kind of area, which you also sometimes hear with open access. I've sat and listened to doctors saying that patients shouldn't have access to papers because they just won't understand it, and they'll misinterpret what's in there, and they'll come to them demanding all of these treatments that are insufficient. And so there is an argument to be made, and again, it's a trade-off. And quite often, I think this one can be shot down with some well-placed explanation of the data, and also just accepting that people are going to misinterpret stuff you say anyway. But it does require consideration. Number 4, it's not very interesting. No one likes to admit this about their research, apart from this guy. so why is your data not very interesting?
I'm not saying my data are not I do a lot of research for instance, contract research for SMEs.
Okay, yeah.
And I just want to have a proof of concept and not more because they would have to pay more. And then you have a small data set which is interesting for them, but I think not interesting for other researchers, for instance. And certainly not if you have to do a lot of effort to put it on the net.
Okay, so again, it's a trade-off between the kind of benefits that you get from putting it online and the work that it takes to do it. But in general, it's not very interesting. It's not on its own a solid reason not to think about putting your data out there. Okay. I don't mind, but someone else might. This could also be my supervisor won't let me, my boss won't let me, my institute won't let me, or my collaborator isn't interested. Anyone got that? We'll go for all of those. Okay, so there's quite a few. We haven't heard from that group. Would you like to just say a few words about the sort of data that other people might mind you releasing? Oh, yeah.
Well, in my case, that relates to the data that you need to buy.
Yeah.
And I think some people might not realize this, but I guess a lot of institutions also that you work for, they buy your data, and then you're not allowed to redistribute it because essentially the company that sells it to you wants to sell it again. And if it's just out there on Figshare, they won't be able to do that. Also, sometimes you sign an NDA, so you get some special data in a project, and then you're not allowed to redistribute it. And sometimes it's even data that you can crawl on the web, like Twitter data. You're not allowed to redistribute it in a structured form.
Yeah. So that also is, I'm not sure I own the data, kind of covers that. So if anyone had it worded in that way, similar reasons. And yeah, there is a legal requirement on you then not to redistribute in a way that breaks the contract or the license or whatever the kind of the way that you've got the data and the agreement that you made with the data providers. So that's a pretty reasonable one for not releasing data. Okay, we might want to use it in another paper. Anybody? Oh, I think you've got bingo. Well done, you guys. That's really quick as well. It's just you as well. So, okay, do you want to just do a little bit of an explanation?
Okay, basically if you spend perhaps many years or something developing a program or something, and then if you don't want to let it out perhaps after the first paper that you publish on it, but you might want to sit on it just to make sure that you can get everything out of it that you worked for before you let others work on it.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's very, very, very common. And so two kind of, if you were given that as an excuse not to do it, two things that you can say are firstly that absolutely you should get credit and you should get the most out of your research. You should have priority over that data. And there are various ways of doing this, including kind of embargo periods and just keeping it private for a short amount of time. What has happened in some disciplines and probably needs to happen in others is just creating a reasonable norm as to the time which you should be allowed to hold on to a particular data set. And it kind of depends exactly what sort of work you're doing, the length of time that is reasonable to make an analysis. But you do get cases now where people just indefinitely never release the data and just keep sort of churning out papers. The problem with this is that who can check that your papers are actually correct in some cases if there's no underlying data to verify the information? I agree. I understand some of the statements that I'm making may not apply to your discipline. Okay, we're in a broad group, but in some cases that's certainly true. So yeah, absolutely. Creators of the data should have the ability to do with it what they want in the priority, but at some stage there has to be a kind of reasonable period of time at which it's made available. Of course. Also, so all of these points apply somewhat slightly differently to places like companies. A lot of the arguments for releasing data are built around the idea that it's public funding that's created the data. So do bear that in mind as well when you're kind of looking at which are valid in different situations. People will contact me to ask about stuff, and I do not have time to deal with all this. So quite a few of you had that as a reason to release the data, that people would contact you. Did anyone have it as a reason not to release the data? Okay, that's good. I like to think that as scientists, we're a fairly collaborative bunch. This is far more likely to come out of government departments than it is to come out of scientists, I hope, anyway. And you've sort of proved that, my little theory there. But yeah, basically people might contact you to ask about the data. Data protection, national security, we sort of covered already in the first point. It's too big. Does anyone have some really big data or can think of some really big data that they'd written down as a reason? Yeah. Video. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So anything like video data is huge. So there are becoming more and more options for some of this type of data, but it does cost money, and that means that you have to budget for the money early on in the project to have enough to kind of cover the costs of data preservation and curation later on. And there is some data where it literally is just too big. I mean, there are people working on certain types of data where it's quicker to just load a van up with hard drives and drive up the motorway or autobahn to deliver the data than it is to actually send it over the internet, because it's just too big. So this can be a genuinely valid excuse, but again, it's that consideration early on. People will see that my data is embarrassingly bad. Okay, as well. A few, yeah, all right. That's okay. You're among friends. We're not going to pass this back. Just share with us your fears on this matter. Who's willing to? No one's. Oh, go on, Joe.
So we didn't do a great amount of validation on the data before we wanted to release it. So there was a lot of nonsense in there, essentially, which we weren't keen on lots of people seeing. But most people actually, maybe the corollary is that when we shared it with people, they were like, "Oh, this is actually better than most data sets we have." So our fears were slightly. The sharing kind of, it was a bit painful, but then we felt a lot better.
Okay, right, you got it out there.
Yeah.
Okay, and it wasn't as bad as you thought,
Wasn't
actually.
as bad.
So your own
Wasn't as
perception of your data was negative. So yeah, some data's bad. I mean, especially if you've got a whole network of sensors that are created. I think someone mentioned earlier, a whole network of sensors creating data in different areas under different parameters, different conditions. And yeah, it's never going to be uniform and perfect, and you're not going to be able to take out all of those outliers. In most cases, it's probably probably better to just get it out there. But, you know, it's a genuine concern, and especially you're wanting to protect your career and your reputation. And, you know, the hope is that as it becomes more and more, as our trendsetters get out there and start publishing stuff, it becomes more and more common that this will be a genuine interaction in science that's okay. But unfortunately, we're still at a point where, you know, no one publishes negative data, and it's terrible to publish anything that kind of you didn't get a proper conclusion out of and all the rest of it. So unfortunately, we're in a kind of reputation and scientific system that is quite detrimental to sharing this sort of data, which is unfortunate. But, you know, we can do our best to change it, and in the meantime, we can scaredly press the share button. Of course, you know, do some cleanup first if you think it's worth it, because that's always helpful. But okay, it's not useful to anyone else. I think we've possibly covered with it's not interesting, but did anyone get that as a separate point anywhere? No? Okay. It's not a priority, and I'm busy. Yeah, a few people. So group there, did you put your hand up?
Yeah. So usually you have enough work with the projects, and when you don't have to publish it openly, your data, it's easy to just not do it, easier.
Yeah, it's definitely easier to not do anything, I agree. And so that is, that is, and you know, you have a certain amount of time allocated to a project, and you could say that the benefit is actually getting the results out there, let alone the data set. You know, if you have to choose, again, it's a trade-off, but you know, more and more it's going to become required. So you're going to have to make time in your schedules, and again, think about it early on. Right, my funder doesn't require it, so I'm not going to bother. Whose funder does require you to share data? Okay, there's not that many of them out there. You think, who are you funded by? Finnish Academy, okay. Finland have been pretty hot on the open science scene quite recently, so it wouldn't surprise me. Anybody else? No, it is increasing. So EPSA, who are the UK Physical Engineering and Physical Sciences Council, have recently started requiring open data coming out of their projects. As we heard earlier, the European Commission is getting there with its open data pilot. So soon that won't be an excuse, probably, for a lot of people. Okay, someone might steal or plagiarize it and not credit me. Anyone got that? Oh, at the back. Would you like to just add a little bit of explanation? I don't know where the microphone's gone. Ah, there we are. We're nearly there.
Okay, so sometimes you have some research you do, and maybe you want to get it patented, or you want to use it as a startup or something else. In that case, if you publish it before you patent it, you might end up in trouble. So that's one reason you might not want to share your data before it is patented or copyrighted.
Yeah, absolutely. So the point was, because I think the microphone's a bit quiet, is that you might not want to share it, especially if you're working with a company, before it's gone through the necessary kind of patent applications and any other intellectual property protection. And that's absolutely true. So I should point out that the patent principles, which I described earlier, very specifically say published papers, published results. So it's the data backing up stuff that you've already published. And that was deliberately to cover that idea that some people will want to kind of protect their data or protect their research and their ideas using intellectual property, such as putting it through a patent application. And that's fine. And then eventually you'll publish a paper. And when you do, the data underlying that should be published. And as I mentioned before, a lot of this is based on the idea that this is publicly funded data that we're talking about, as opposed to commercially funded data. Most companies can pretty much do what they like with their data. Obviously, there are arguments to be made where that data impacts policy or impacts is in the public interest to release it, but it's a much more kind of murky area. So it's good that not many of you had got that excuse, actually, which means that you have faith in the scientific system, which is quite nice, and that all of your fellow researchers will cite you properly and play nicely. The fact is, at some point, someone will steal something. It just happens, but it already happens. It's just that they find out about it at a conference, or they find out about it from a colleague, as opposed to getting your data set from the internet and using it without crediting you. So it's how much you're worried about your particular field and the people in it, I suppose. I'm not sure I own the data we covered. I don't know how. Did anyone put that. I don't know how, or it's too difficult. Well, that's unfortunate, because I'm about to go over that one. So clearly this is a useless second half of the talk. But I don't know how is fairly common, because it is complicated. And again, I'm not going to go over the exact specifics of how you get your own data set and manipulate it and put it into a format and find somewhere to put it and do it and license it and all the rest of it. But I am going to go over sort of 5 easy steps, which are a little bit higher level, to how you can go about sharing your data. Okay, it's quite difficult to share data. It takes a lot of work, as we've already mentioned, and it does take more time. We're not pretending here. It's more work and it's more time out of your valuable and busy schedules to make data suitable for reuse. So this is my own 5 steps to sharing. Okay, number 1, be motivated to share your data. If you don't want to do it, it's probably not going to happen, or at least not happen in a way that's useful for anyone else. Also, you're going to have to get motivated because, as we mentioned, quite often more and more funders are going to start to require you to do it. Okay, so research data management plans were mentioned earlier. You might think that you don't need a research data management plan. But there are PhD students and early career researchers who have gone before you and would disagree. So this is a poster that appeared on a notice board in the chemistry department at Cambridge University, offering a cash reward for return of this rucksack containing 5 years of research data, crucial for his PhD thesis. We don't know if he ever got it back, but as you can imagine, so he'd been doing really well. He'd backed everything up on an external hard drive really regularly, except it was in the same bag as the computer, so that didn't work out. And there are also stories online of people who have had laptops and computers stolen from departments and lost all of their research data. So research data management plans are becoming more and more a part of creating a proposal. But it isn't just losing the data that you've got to worry about, it's what you're going to do with it. And the point here is that you should be building into your thinking about your project and how you're capturing the data, how you're storing the data, and how you might make it suitable for reuse before you actually start capturing the data. And we've all gone to those stats courses and experimental design courses where they say all about all of the things that you're supposed to do before you start capturing the data, and then you just go and sit at the lab bench anyway and just do it. But this really does deserve a little bit of consideration and start thinking about it really early on. And secondly, talk about it. So talking about data sharing to your colleagues, bosses, collaborators, funders, etc., will solve some of the issues in the bingo grid that relate to not knowing if you can, not knowing if other people will be happy with it, not knowing what the requirements are. So talk to people. There are often people in institutions who have a lot of experience with this, and at least you'll know where you stand and be able to kind of to understand that everyone's on board, get the message in early that you're required to share data and get everyone on board at the start of the project. Don't leave it until the week before you're supposed to be submitting the journal article to realise that actually that journal requires the data and no one else has been documenting theirs in the same way that you have. So having a kind of combined approach is very, very helpful. Another thing to point out about is talking to data providers in advance regarding future sharing, because you need permissions from data providers, from if you're using particularly human research subjects, they have to sign a waiver, so they need to know what's happening with that data downstream. There are large projects that have messed up on this. So there's a project in Oxford called the Malaria Atlas Project, and they gathered hundreds of data sets from health agencies, public health institutes, public health surveillance bodies in many, many, many countries. They got it all together. They thought, brilliant, we've got this beautiful map of malaria incidents. Let's publish it, and let's publish all the data, because that would be a great thing to do. And then they realized they hadn't actually asked the data providers if they could do that. So they had to go back and call and email 300 data providers to get the permissions that they needed. And so thinking beforehand, what do I want to do with this data at the end of my project, can really save you a lot of time later on. Okay, number 2. Try and stay on top of your data. So this is important generally, as we all know, and also remarkably difficult to do because you've got too much time doing other things. You've got to go and do the lab work. You've got to go and analyze things. You've got to write software. You've got to make machines. You know, there's a whole bunch of stuff that is not managing your data. Okay, so here's a little game. Pick the face that you make when you suddenly realize you need to analyze this data set and you haven't named one of the columns and it was 3 months ago and you cannot remember for the life of you what that parameter was that you tried to feed into your model. Number 2, you've analyzed some data in R and you just can't remember which of the 10 different versions that you created and didn't properly number was the one that you actually put in and gave you the results that you want to put in your paper. I'm seeing some nods of recognition around the room, which is good. It's not just me. And okay, which of my 3 lab books did the protocol end up in? Did I spin it for 20 minutes or 30 minutes? I usually do it for 20, but I can't really remember which date I did it on, and now I've got to go back. So everybody has problems with staying on top of their data because we're all very, very busy people. And I think I've probably gone through all of those but throughout my PhD of just that time you realise, oh man, I forgot to fill that in. I thought I'd remember, and then the next day I forgot to go back to it, and now I can't remember. So to share, if you're expecting to share your data and you've got the expectation that it will be useful to other people and reused, you have to be able to understand it. And more importantly, you 4 years later have to be able to understand it. So if you've got your data documented to the extent where a few years down the line, you're fairly confident that you could come back and know exactly what you were doing, then you're probably in a fairly good position. And this is where all the work comes in, right? This is really the hardest bit. But there is help out there. So, you know, there are best practices in many research communities. Some are further forward with this than others. So I'll give one example, which is biosharing.org. So unfortunately, the image got a bit distorted here, but basically they have catalogues for all sorts of biological data, including policies. So you can check what different funding agencies and institutions have as policies for what you actually need to do with your data. Very useful at the start. They've got a standards registry, which tells you things like ways you can describe data in a standard way that other people will recognize. A lot of research areas have ontologies, some don't, but ontologies allow you to use standard wording to describe certain data types, and also create metadata that goes alongside your data set, so things like protocol descriptions and other stuff. And if you're doing computational analysis, there are quite a lot of tools to enable you to kind of store the workflow and what you actually did to the data at each step. And I'm not going to go into all of them because you're all doing very different types of research, but have a look around your research community and find out what's available to help you. And there are registries of databases, so there's ideas of where you could put the data, and again, that differs between different disciplines. So there are lots of online courses and guides. There are probably research data management courses run in your institutes, and all of that stuff you can kind of tool yourself and be ready to tackle sharing some data. Okay. So the point about this is that it's not just jumping over hurdles or jumping through hoops, and that's the reason that you're sharing, because what that will result in is a bunch of PDF files exported straight from Excel that are bunged on an institutional website somewhere that no one can find and no one can use, because if anyone's tried to export a table from a PDF, it's really hard. And this happens so often because someone's decided the day before that they submit their journal article, oh God, I've got to put the data in, right, Excel, PDF, export, up we go, supplementary data. It's not reusable. So if you're going to share and you want to share, then make it like you want to share and do a whole bunch of things to make it discoverable. Put it on a properly indexed repository, something that people can find through standard internet search engines, which often is not your web page, your personal web page, or some of the sort of more closed off academic networks. So think about making it discoverable. If you're going to go to all the effort, you may as well allow people to see it. And get your data ready for reuse. So much data that is out there, and this is true of science, it's true of government data, it's true of whole bunches of data sets. sure they're open in that they're online and they're licensed under an appropriate license, and technically they fulfill all of the requirements of the patent principles, but you just can't use them because you've got to sit there and type out because someone's made it into an image file. So I've had to sit there and type out like 300 DNA bases because someone shared a DNA sequence as an image instead of as a text file. So it's just little things like that that are really helpful to consider. Could I use my own data if I downloaded it and tried to reanalyze it? You know better than anyone else how to handle your data. So you know better than anyone else what the most useful form for your data to be in is, and try and get that. Again, think to yourself, if I move away and I do a couple of postdocs and I'm kind of not working on this topic anymore, but actually I suddenly have a thought and I want to reanalyze something, could you go back in 5 to 10 years' time, download your data set and go and do something with it? And if the answer is no, then just think about what the barriers would be to yourself. And if it's yes, then well done. You're doing everything right. So get it ready for reuse, because that's really what open is about. It's not just about ticking a box. It's about actually making a collaborative ecosystem or a knowledge commons or whatever you want to call it, but something that we can all share in and collaborate. Okay, make the most of it. I'm not going to cover this at all because Joe and Peter are going to come up and talk to you about making the most of having produced your data and getting some getting recognition for your open science work. That's the next talk. But do that because that makes it all worthwhile. So, and there are many benefits. Again, we'll just brush over them. Things like career recognition, new collaborations, citations, and lots of this you came up with in your group discussions. So you've clearly got the idea of what you can get out of it, and just try and make sure that you do everything to make sure that you are getting these things. And number 5 is play fair. So if you are producing data, it goes back to the point about reciprocity and about citation and do unto other people's data what you would have them do unto yours. And cite their data, get in contact with them, collaborate, and do everything that you hope people will do with your own. And we can hopefully change the way people work around their data. Okay, so there's the 5 steps. Get motivated and start early. Have a plan early. Manage expectations of your collaborators and all the other people that touch your data along the way to publishing something. Keep on top of your data. Will you understand it in 4 or 6 or 8 years? And what are the best practices in your field? Share it like you really want to share it, not like you're ticking a funder box. Make it discoverable and reusable. Metadata is very, very important for being able to link it to other data sets, for being able to find it and all of those kinds of things. So what sort of metadata is the best practice in your field? Again, it goes back to kind of keeping on top of that. Make the most of it, write data papers, do publications, get citations, report to funders that you've done this, and set an example with other people's data and use it. Does anyone have any questions? I think I'm at time, so hopefully not many. Okay, well, you can come and talk to me at any point. And this is now on SlideShare, and those are all the image credits and licenses. So knock yourself out. If you want to download it, it's on my SlideShare account. Thank you very much.